So, thanks, Stephan, for the introduction. I am, just a few words about myself. I'm a research software engineer and a doctoral researcher in the Sustainable Software Engineering Group at the Institute for Software Technology at DLR, which is the German Aerospace Center, and the Department of Computer Science here at Humboldt, here in quotations. I'm also a fellow of the Software Sustainability Institute and co-lead of the citation file format, and one of the PIs of the Helmholtz metadata collaboration project HERMES, which is what I'm going to talk about today, about HERMES and its aim to automate the publication of software together with rich metadata. Of course, I'm not doing this work all by myself. Parts of equal partners in the project are Oliver Bertuch from FZ Jülich, Oliver Knodel from HCDR, Guido Juckeland from HZ as well, and my colleague Tobias Schlauch. And I'll start with a few general words about software publication and then go on to present the project, where and how it plans to help with software publication, before going into details about the software metadata that we will deal with within the project. I'll also talk about what publication platforms we target and what the project will provide in terms of reusable outputs for you. And finally, I'll conclude by briefly discussing what the impact of the project on the state of software publication can be. So let's start with some good news. There is growing consensus and awareness that research software is not only important as a research method, but it's also important as a research output. And this, I think, should actually be a point of pride for us RSEs, because it means we do important work, right? That's nice to know, but also we expect a return on this RSE work that we do that suits the system we work in. And this return should come in the currency that we call academic credit. Now, credit is assigned to us as RSEs, mostly through citation and specifically software citation. But in order for something to be citable in the first place, it must be published. And this makes software publication an important part of our work. Credit, though, isn't everything, and we should also publish our software to make it more sustainable. Similar to papers, software that is prepared for publication should meet some quality criteria that will make it technically more sustainable, but also the publication process itself will make the software more findable, accessible, and reusable. And I'm sure that you've heard these words before, especially when it comes with sufficient documentation and metadata. And I'll talk about metadata later on as well. Another point is that publishing software makes it easier to cite and to trace the software through the whole of the research process for which it is used. And it will therefore also support better reproducibility of the research results that have been gained using research software. There is some less good news. You may have noticed that some of the words I've used are familiar to you: findable, accessible, reusable. And these are all part of the acronym FAIR, which has been used to describe, up until now, at least a set of principles for the publication of research data, and is currently in the process of being adapted for research software as well. And that's good news in itself. And in theory, we're all very happy to accept these principles and follow them in practice, especially now that they're being picked up in guidelines and policies. I've pictured some of the guidelines here, and we're happy to follow them in practice, also because there's increasing pressure from these guidelines and policies to follow them. But in practice, this means that we will have to do a lot of extra work to get our software published according to the FAIR principles. And particularly this work is often work that I, for one, abhor, which is manual work. As an example of this, I've pictured here the submission form for a Zenodo publication of, for example, your software. It's a long list of free text fields which you will all have to fill in manually to make sure that all the correct and complete metadata for your software is in there. So we thought that as RSEs, we tend to favor automation over manual work, for example, in builds and tests, etc. But like I said, to date, the process of completing submission forms for the publication of our software with the relevant metadata is still mainly manual. And sometimes we also may have to pull together the relevant metadata from different sources, and it may come in different forms, etc. Another example of this is the workshop that has been run on Monday during this conference by colleagues from the German Aerospace Center, Humboldt University, and the KIT. And in that workshop, they've made it clear or clearer what kind of metadata we're actually looking at when we talk about fair software. And this is some of the things are listed up down here in the bullet list on this slide. So we're talking about persistent identifiers, namely DOIs for software, rich metadata that can be used for accessibility. We want to document our dependencies. We're talking about licenses, about provenance, and all that for every single version we want to publish of our software. And following a specific software development workflow, the number of versions can grow really quickly. So for each new version, we will have to fill out a publication form manually, which is something that we really want to avoid. Taking a step back and looking at software publication from a more high vantage point, let's have a look at what this actually looks like today in terms of software publication according to FAIR principles. Very roughly summarizing, we publish software, or at least the metadata pertaining to it, in a publication repository, such as Zenodo or any institutional solution you may have at your institution based on Invenio RDM, Dataverse, or any other publication repository software. And when we do so, we get a persistent identifier for the publication, and that means that we're basically good to go. So on the one hand, we have the metadata that pertains to a software, and in cases of open source software, we also have artifacts such as the software source code. And on the other hand, we have there is a choice of publication repositories that satisfy the current state-of-the-art in FAIR publications. And the question is now, how do we get one into the other without adding too much work to our development process and our general schedules? And this is where we think the HERMES project can help. To be more specific, like we said, we have publication repositories, and these have metadata input forms usually. Some may also employ, some may also employ pull-based workflows which pull metadata from our software source code repositories to use them in the publication. But those give us little control over what metadata actually goes into them. One example of those is the GitHub Zenodo bridge. Some of you may know that you can activate this in Zenodo, and whenever you make a new release on GitHub, this will automatically be pulled over into the Zenodo repository, including some metadata. And the problem is that this bridge uses by default just what it finds in the GitHub metadata. And so we have to go back into Zenodo, have a look at our publication, edit it, fix all the metadata by hand. Things like the list of authors who may just be populated from the list of contributors in the repository, which may not be the actual authoritative list of authors, the software name, etc., which may default to the repository name, etc., etc. And on the other hand, we have all this software metadata, which may be strewn across different places. Some of it we find in the source code repository, in a file, such as a license file. Some of it is hidden in the Git history, such as the list of committers, which may be the list of potential authors, but which may be something else completely. Other metadata is part of the platform metadata on GitHub or GitLab, depending on what you use, such as the number of releases. Other metadata like code coverage, for example, must be obtained from third-party platforms, and some metadata may simply be in our heads only. Now, any solution, not even HERMES, can help you with the latter if metadata is only head, and you should really think about writing all the relevant metadata down in a metadata file. But we do know that we don't want to use submission forms that we have to manually complete to put all these metadata in. What we do need is control over what metadata goes into a software publication. For example, like I said, not all committers that have committed something in version control to a software project may actually qualify as authors, and vice versa as well. We do want to adhere to good and fair principles and want to supply a set of useful and correct metadata. And these three last things are things that we hope the HERMES project can help with. So before we go into the details, a few words about the project itself. It's a backronym and stands for Helmholtz-Rich Metadata Software Publication. And its aim is to provide solutions for automated workflows that can be employed to publish software together with rich metadata in publication repositories. We're funded by the Helmholtz Metadata Collaboration, HMC, which is a project of the Helmholtz Association. And the project is spread over 3 Helmholtz centers, namely the DLR, Forschungszentrum Jülich, and HZDR. And we're collaborating across all these centers very well. We've recently published a concept paper about what we're aiming to do in the project, and we're also soliciting public reviews and comments on a website called PubPeer. You can find the links here. You can also find the links in the pad that pertains to this session. And we started building a simple website at software-metadata.pub. So these are the 2 main points you should go to if you need more details. This talk is based mostly on the concept paper. So if you are interested in getting even more details than I can provide in this talk, please read the paper. Right, so to formally set up the scope of the project, I'm actually going to read you this. Don't worry, I'm going to offer a more accessible overview in a minute. But in our concept paper, we describe the scope of the project as follows. The user, which is an RSE, receives assistance in depositing software in an automated fashion. This may be used to create publications purely with rich metadata, and that's for closed source software, for example. We're not allowed to publish the source code, which can still be fair, because fair doesn't mean open, or with attached artifacts like source code, executors, etc., to be more easily reusable. To achieve this, HERMES provides an extensible, configurable, and automatable toolchain with the capability to be executed for an arbitrary number of software publications in arbitrary target publication repositories from the same origin, which is a source code repository, as configured by the user. And we're doing that by initially harvesting and collating statically available metadata from the described metadata sources, actually described in the concept paper. I'm going to talk about the metadata sources in a bit. And then initially targeting publication repositories based on either Invenio RDM or the Dataverse project. And we're doing this for deposits of metadata and artifacts according to curator-defined requirements. I'm going to talk about curator-defined requirements just a bit later on. And output of the respective metadata that we collect and collate in a structured format, for example, a code meta file for further reuse. Now, here is something that I hope is a better overview of what this actually means, and I'll walk you through it now. Hope you can see my cursor. I've tried to use a laser pointer thing that Windows gives me, but the situation is the following. You, an RSE, pushes a change to your software to a source code repository. And on a configured condition, such as when you push a tag to release a new version of your software, this will then trigger a continuous integration / continuous deployment system. And this system will execute the HERMES workflow, is what we call it. I'll give you more details about the HERMES workflow in a bit, but what the workflow does, it goes and it grabs all the relevant metadata from a number of sources. These can be like metadata files in the repository, so citation.cff or codemeta.json. It can be code or documentation files. It can be metadata provided by the version control system or the development platform, GitHub or GitLab, and even some third-party platforms. For example, if you calculate code coverage for your project. The collected metadata is collated into, well, collated in this case means deduplicated, for example, and into a unified set of software metadata. That's the rich metadata we're talking about. And the collated metadata is then pushed to a target publication repository where you receive an ID. And this ID you can also take and add it to the collated set of metadata, which you can optionally then update your local metadata files with. This is a very simplified overview, keep that in mind. If you want to see a more detailed picture of this, then please go and read the concept paper. And now, because the HERMES project cannot do everything at the same time, and because we operate in a specific context, namely the Helmholtz Association in our case, we will implement what we like this solution we propose for systems that are being used widely across Helmholtz. And specifically, this means that we will provide an automated workflow software that works with two source code repository systems, GitLab and GitHub, and the respective CI/CD solutions, and that's GitLab CI and GitHub Actions, and also we're thinking about supporting Jenkins. And we're targeting Invenio RDM-based and Dataverse-based publication repositories, because these are the repositories of the repository software that drives most of the Helmholtz repositories. Of course, we'll take care that in future iterations of this project or in follow-on projects or even other projects, more systems can be added. Now, this is, as you can see, this is the main part of the actual HERMES workflow, the software. And if we zoom into this, it implements 4 discrete pipelines, and all of these have public interfaces, rather naively shown here as circles with question marks in them. So you can attach different tools to those pipelines. And where possible in these pipelines that we implement, we'll reuse existing tooling for metadata processing, for example. That's state of the art. And if we have time later, I can mention some of these tools in the Q&A. So the pipelines in detail are a metadata harvesting pipeline, which is the first step. So this basically runs a metadata analysis on the source code repository to discover the existing metadata and also determine the tooling that we need to apply to these metadata. It also retrieves the metadata so that we have a set of metadata from the source code repository. Being fed back into the workflow, this then triggers the metadata processing pipeline. And this pipeline validates the retrieved metadata, for example, with some checks for conflicting resources, conflicting sources, conflicting metadata fields, and merges all the metadata that we have found into a coherent set back into the workflow and then into the metadata deposition pipeline. And this is more or less optionally elicits metadata requirements from target publication repositories and matches them with the merge set of metadata that we have. Now, what are metadata requirements? This could be required fields that you need for a publication on the specific repository. And if it's not, if none of the field, if the metadata point is not found in the coherent set, then we are going back to the user telling them that. What the deposition pipeline also does is it publishes the metadata with or without the respective software artifacts to the target repositories. And this means that you can actually publish fairly your closed source software with this workflow as well. You don't have to attach source code if this is not something you can do. It also retrieves the persistent identifier from the publication platform and feeds it back into the metadata set. And finally, we have a post-processing pipeline, and that can be used to update the metadata in your source repositories, for example, with the deposition identifier, with a PID you've received from the publication repository. It notifies the user of any issues that were encountered during the workflow, and it passes the software and deposit metadata to any following steps in the user's CI/CD workflow. And this is then the main output of the HERMES project, namely reference implementation of this workflow for the CI/CD solutions that I've mentioned, so GitLab CI, GitHub Actions, and Jenkins, perhaps. Now let's talk a bit about software metadata and what kind of software metadata we'll actually work with in HERMES. I mentioned previously that metadata can live in different places and come in different forms. There are also differences in how metadata is being generated. For example, some of them are proactively provided by developers in metadata files in the source code repository. Some metadata are generated as a side product of version control or continuous integration. But there is also a difference between, say, generic software metadata that you can also find in other types of publications. For example, the name of the software, authorship information, legal licensing information, domain context, so what context, what research domain provides the context for a specific software, etc., etc. Citation metrics, location metadata, where you can find the software, publication dates, etc. And there is software-specific metadata, which includes things like dependency information, what programming language has been used, the runtime requirements, quality metrics, development metrics, etc. And these metadata, all of these metadata, can come in different formats and modes. Some of it, like I said, you can find in dedicated files in a specific format. You can find them as parts of files and API responses from third-party systems. And some of it will just be unstructured, for example, as part of plain text files, such as the README file for a project. So to get us started and to guarantee that we can produce reliable results in terms of the metadata, the HERMES workflow will first focus on collectible, easily collectible, structured metadata that is metadata which is readily available in structured sources, such as metadata files called meta.json, citation CFF, and platform APIs, for example. And then when we have the time and resources to go beyond that, we will turn next towards mining metadata from these structured sources. And finally, we'll also attempt to mine metadata from unstructured sources, such as README files, etc. Again, if you're interested in learning more about the details of this, please read the concept paper. Like I said, we target two different publication repository software platforms, and as a matter of fact, both target systems do actually need some work for them to be in a position to accept what we produce, to usefully provide the metadata in the publications that we push towards them. So as for Dataverse, we will, in the scope of the project, also improve the metadata schema to fully support the code meta schema and also software versioning. And we will add support for some of the software-related parts of the data site schema, and perhaps do some work on the user interface so that it better supports software publications and not just data sets. There is some work to be done on in-venue RDM as well, and we'll improve it to be able to accept deposits and updates from the workflow software. And for both projects, we will work with the upstream developers so that this functionality can actually be rolled out to all the repositories, like institutional repositories, using these software products. And when I talk about workflow pipelines, remember the 4 pipelines we have, I've also mentioned curation as part of the 3rd pipeline. And this specifically means that requirements can be posed by a target publication platform, such as a in-venue RDM or Dataverse system, with regard to, for example, what metadata fields are required. And what we're doing is that we will query these requirements before publication, and then feedback any missing or mistyped metadata points to the user, so that can be fixed on the user side, and another run can be made towards a publication in the target publication platform. Okay, that was very quick, but we're still almost at the end of this presentation. I'd like to first summarize what may actually be the most interesting part of this, namely what we aim to provide to you as participants of this session, and what you can hopefully then use in your daily work as RSEs. So first up, we will publish our software for the publication workflow, for the automation as open source with interfaces for extension. We will also publish reference implementations for often used CI/CD solutions, so the ones I've mentioned. And on top of this, and this kind of nicely links back to the talk by Tobias on HIFIS, we will adapt training materials that already exist, for example, in HIFIS, to include information on how to work with the HERMES workflow. And these training materials, as also mentioned previously, are openly published and available to everyone. So the knowledge that is being produced in the HERMES project will hopefully then be easily accessible for all of you. Finally, like I said, we have the HERMES project website, and that'll collect all the relevant information in one place. And finally, we'll submit proposals for updates to relevant policies and guidelines on the Helmholtz and Allianzinitiative levels to push for a better practice of software publication, also from the top-down perspective. So hopefully, software publication will be better supported in the future. Last but not least, a few words on how HERMES will advance the state of the art in software publication. First of all, and that's the very obvious one, it enables automated publication of software with rich metadata so as to satisfy the FAIR principles for research software. This will work even when you're working on closed source software, because remember that FAIR doesn't mean that your output must be open. Open metadata is enough, but we do, of course, urge you to use free and open source licenses for the benefit of open science whenever you can. Secondly, as part of the more general automation of publication, we also automate the collation of metadata from different sources, and this may actually come in handy for other use cases as well, such as keeping citation metadata files in your repository up to date, for example. And finally, and this is something that I haven't spoken about in great detail, but I can do so during Q&A if you want, we'll provide a way to work with cases beyond what we perceive as the ideal repository setup. And this means that the workflow can work with repositories that contain something else than just exactly one software package only. Meaning that when you have the case, we have a mixed repository, for example, that contains software and data sets and perhaps a manuscript or two about the work, then this is something that you will be able to configure in the HERMES workflows so that only parts of the repository will be targeted and that only what you think should be in the publication actually goes into the publication. And with this, I'm done. Thanks for listening. Thanks for the RSE22 program committee. Giving me the chance to talk about this here. My colleagues in HERMES, of course. And I think we have 3 minutes for questions.